And so what do psychedelics do? Well, they shatter defense, and that's why they're as scary as they are. And also controversial, because why, for example, when people have come in and challenged psychedelic therapy, they've said things like, it was like I was left on the operating room table. It was open heart surgery. They opened up my heart. I'd closed my heart down and I was okay like that. Thank you very much. You opened my heart up, you son of a gun, and then you left me there. You can see it's like you made me vulnerable. I felt again, and then you sauntered off. That's the resentment. And when you hear it, you can feel it and you're sorry for it. That's the limitation that we're looking at.
Welcome to Modern Enlightenment, a sanctuary for your soul, where we'll go on a path of personal and spiritual development. I'm Austin Mao.
And I'm Chuchu Wang. We are your companions on this journey of self-discovery and spiritual connection.
Join us as we delve into the fusion of modern psychotherapy, neuroscience, psychospirituality, and shamanic plant sacrament ceremonies, exploring the transformative potential of psychedelics for the mind, body, and spirit.
Our mission is to guide you to a place of profound awareness where emotions can be felt.
Together, let's illuminate the way to a brighter, more enlightened existence.
Modern Enlightenment, where your journey to inner peace begins.
All right, welcome back to Modern Enlightenment. I'm really excited because I'm joined by Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. He's a Ralph Metzner Distinguished Professor in Neurology and Psychiatry at UC San Francisco, where he leads the Carhart-Harris Lab and is considered one of the foremost researchers and scientists in the field of psychedelics. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you, Austin. Good to be with you.
I'm really pleased to see you again. We were on this beautiful island together, Richard Branson's island, at his first psychedelic summit just a few months ago. And wow, what a collection of people that were there, such as you, such as Sandeep, another scientist, Rick Doblin, advocates, funders, etc. And what was so fascinating about it was, it really feels like we're at a pivotal time now in the field of psychedelics, right? On the legalization front, Colorado is just about to start issuing licenses, being the second state. On the research front, there's so much research that's been coming out, including from your lab, that shares just how promising psychedelics is for mental health and mental wellness. And you've been riding this wave, you've been leading this wave for quite some time at the scientific front. So I'm curious just to start off with, what led you to be interested in psychedelics as a field of study? What got you into this field?
Well, yeah, I guess when I was a young man, really a teenager, more a child in a sense than an adult. Yeah, you get drawn into subcultures. I was drawn into dance music and kind of rave culture in the UK. And I guess the circles I was moving in, drugs were never too far away. And psychedelics and LSD in particular particularly intrigued me. I think naturally from the off, I had a curious disposition. And so hearing about LSD, I just wanted to know. And it wasn't hard to sort of seek it out. And I turned on at the tender age of 14. And thankfully, things worked out. It didn't send me, crazy. Maybe it did for a few hours, but I came through it. And I guess it ignited a even deeper curiosity about the drugs, about the mind, about the brain. I gravitated towards psychology more and more. Whether that would have happened otherwise, I'm not sure. Gravitated towards neuroscience, so I could see and appreciate that mind and brain are two sides of the same coin, so entwined. And so I respected that, and I wanted to know what the hell was it doing to my brain, the LSD. And so I kind of went down the path very young through personal experience and then through, the studious academic path. And I wasn't particularly studious, as you might glean from finding drugs so young. But that's the funny way it works. It's quite pure in a sense, you could say, dressing it up. A sort of pure intention, to want to understand and drawn into academia through a very, pure intention of wanting to understand rather than trying to achieve or please the parents or something. So yeah, that's part of my story in a nutshell.
something that I'm really with is this, how science works from my understanding is we have an experience, right? And then we seek to prove the causal effects of that experience, right? The if this, then that. What are the kind of early experiences that you had with LSD or that really led into that curiosity? In other words, what are you trying to prove?
I wouldn't say it's trying to prove, it's more trying to understand, a sort of subtle difference there. And I was like, what the hell was that? Brought up with religion. I went to church every Sunday, thanks to my good mother. So I had the magic that was there from religion, it was Catholicism, rich with magic, Catholicism. And that's the narrative, that's the worldview, that's how to understand reality and who you are and what happens to you when you die. And I guess, maybe psychedelics played a role in blowing all of that open. And in fact, the experience wasn't really that pleasant. It was probably most of it was unpleasant, if not, frankly, nightmarish. And it was colored, I think, by my background. I thought I died because otherwise, how could one experience something as otherworldly as this? That was my only explanation. Well, I must have died somehow. And so then in my head, I was like, I think I've been hit by a car and now I'm in some kind of limbo state. So, I mean, really, it was that view of what the hell was that? And it wasn't an immediate, like, oh, there's my thread. That's what I'll follow for the rest of my life. It was more, I guess, a teenager stunned by this experience. Yeah, I did keep going back with subsequent LSD experiences and later, MDMA and other compounds, but it was more a desire to deeper understand what happened there. Yeah.
Beautiful. Just as I'm seeing you share this and kind of looking down into the left, revisiting your memories, I'm also revisiting my own memories of being with LSD and my early usage of psychedelic substances. And that term you use, nightmarish, right? Like that first feeling of death being so extraordinary, yet leading you down a path of deep curiosity. What the hell was that? And now you're at this forefront of research that is at such a detailed level of understanding. How close do you feel you are now to the understanding that you craved as a teenager?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's hard to kind of plot it on a scale like a VAS from complete understanding. It's difficult to know because, you don't know what you don't know as well. But we've got a handle on some things. It's clearer to me today, not really through my own research, but others, how the drugs, at least the classic psychedelics, are working on a molecular level, what they bind to in terms of proteins in cell membranes and maybe in cells, the so-called serotonin 2A receptors. And then, this entropic brain model continues to be a guide for me. That's something I came up with first on paper, so to speak, in 2014, when I published this hot mess of paper about anything and everything, but maybe had a through thread that psychedelics cause a kind of dysregulation, or I guess in popular parlance, chaos in the brain. And that's why it's chaotic in one's experience. The two go hand in hand. So a movement towards disorder in the brain and a accompanying movement towards kind of disorder in one's conscious experience. So we have that. It's a solid principle. And when you find a good principle, it tells you ideally something not just about the focal thing of interest, but it starts to tell you about other things that you weren't actually necessarily expecting. So in my mind, it's a very useful, honestly, I think maybe, at least for me personally, sure, it's my model, but maybe the most useful model of conscious states that we have. I need to do a better job of articulating that, but I'm working on it. Try and do it in a book. But yeah, it seems to work. Yeah, it kind of works because it works. It's effective. It describes and predicts very well. And then, we have other things like seeing the mind and the brain through this perspective of predictive processing. So popular writers and thinkers today, you might go with a Donald Hoffman or a even like Deepak Chopra, and then others like Carl Friston, more sort of detailed scientific writings on functioning of the brain and mind. But anyway, the essential idea, Anil Seth, his very popular TED talk, we hallucinate our conscious experience. But the gist of it is that we experience the world through internal models, and those internal predictive models, predictive processing, dominates our experience of the world, albeit through a kind of handshake or interaction with sensory information coming in. But don't underestimate the power and influence of the top down, of the prediction. And things like optical illusions are little reminders of that. Take the Kinesa triangle where you've got, say, just 3 components, black like circles with wedges cut out of them, 3 of them, and you see a triangle in the middle that's not there because of predictive mechanisms. You catch the gist of things and see this thing because that's how the brain and mind works ordinarily. As Aldous Huxley said, the brain is in the main eliminative. So it doesn't produce, it more compresses and eliminates information. And so what does that look like or feel like? It's catching the gist of things. Just like what we're doing now, making these sounds with our vocal cords that we hopefully each understand. There's a lot of granularity there, but we don't bother ourselves about the granular. We just catch the gist. And it's quite remarkable that we work this way, and we're working that way all the time. We throw in a psychedelic and that kind of sophisticated compression and gist catching breaks down. And that's part of why it's so weird. It's like all these unconscious assumptions about what's what, as Aldous Huxley would say, about the way things are, the way we are. They start to crumble, and that's weird as hell, scary as hell. And that's, a major part of the picture. So, after the entropic brain and part of the entropic brain, I put out this model called Rebus, Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics, which took the predictive processing model and drop of psychedelic LSD into the punch to say that what psychedelics do is that they dial down prediction. So, that sophisticated compression, the catching the gist, that's dialed right down. And so we don't really catch the gist, and we're not sure what's what and who we are, and it all gets very weird, and stuff comes up and that ordinarily is kept down. And so that was Rebus. And so, I guess what's happened over the years that I've done human brain imaging with psychedelics is that I've picked up some principles. I guess I went looking or sniffing like a dog for the answer, and I guess I picked up kind of rules, looking for heuristics. And yeah, to me, they're useful. I think to others, they're useful. And there's more, of course, but I think the entropic brain and Rebus are pretty useful kind of guideposts for understanding how psychedelics work.
What I'm getting from your explanation, thank you for providing it in such easy to understand terms, or at least I believe easy to understand terms, is that we have our brains are encoded to, maybe you could say, optimize, right? Take sensory information and then make meaning out of it. And then the psychedelic process disrupts that sort of patterning system, right? I think you wrote about the default mode network and that being quieted, right? And in that, we have the opportunity to investigate maybe our identity or maybe our circumstances in a way that would have been, maybe you could say, hardened before. Did I get that right so far?
So, the default mode thing has become a popular trope, and it's not wrong. It's just subtly different. It's not that it's quietened as such. It's more like it's melted down. So in a sense, it's actually excited, but excited in a way that dysregulates its functioning and causes it to break down, disintegrate. Like how if you put a knob of butter in a frying pan and added heat, it's going to melt. So yeah, that's a dodgy analogy when you think this is your brain on drugs, cracking an egg into a frying pan. But it is what it is. Best not to think of it as good or bad. It's the breaking down of a system and other systems that perform this compression. That's likely, no one really knows, but likely a lot of what the default mode network's functioning does is to compress like so much of the brain. and give us the gist of things, including the gist of ourselves, like who we are, what our memories are, what our narratives are, how we think of ourselves, even our ability to think of ourselves, self-reflection, thinking about other people, social functioning, catching the gist there, an imagination as well, locking it down into something that we're imagining, whatever it is, that kind of ego tunnel, as Thomas Metzinger would call it. These are all default mode functions. And, so when psychedelics come in and excite the brain, they're exciting the default mode network. There's a lot of these target serotonin 2A receptors there, and that's causing an excitation where those cells are. But the excitation doesn't translate into regularity in brain function. It doesn't dial up the default mode network. It's really working on a dimension of order to chaos or order to disorder. Yes, it's exciting the brain, but it's pushing it towards disorder. And so that translates into the breakdown of the default mode network. So you can see it's subtly different. Instead of like up or down functioning, almost like a thermostat, it's more how a thermostat, or temperature rather, would translate into order versus disorder. If things freeze, it's going towards order. If things melt or vaporize, it's going towards disorder. So that's the kind of axis I think is most helpful to think about conscious states. And that's the entropic brain principle, if you want.
Earlier, you used the phrase top-down approach somewhere in this discussion, and you had referenced being taken to church before, right, as a kid by your parents. And, when I visit my own psychedelic experiences and when I sort of support people in theirs, very often they describe having spiritual experiences, which is often described as something extraordinarily expansive, like ineffable, right? Larger than words can possibly encapsulate. And I wonder if the experience of shutting down that, or maybe dysregulating the patterning system that creates gists out of so much information, right? And exposing ourselves to the chaos of so much information, but also being able to observe that in a way that our brain normally wouldn't, if that is a spiritual experience that people has, right? Something that is far larger, far greater than they're able to have in a normal waking state.
Quite. And I guess it suggests in a sense that the ordinary compression of normal waking consciousness isn't conducive for, in fact, it works against the spiritual experience. However we want to articulate that, spiritual experience, mystical experience, non-dual awareness, what would it be in Hinduism? I don't know, Brahman, or no self in Buddhism. This communion or union with something greater, interconnectedness with all things, particularly animate things or living things, or at least an appreciation perhaps of living things. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a sublime thing. It's something that we have a capacity for as a species. It's curious to ask whether other species do too. I don't know. Maybe they inhabit something like that ordinarily. I don't know. But that's the thing. And it's a world away from, reciting the creed at a Catholic mass. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty. It's a shame. It's almost a tragedy, because that experience is there in organized religion as well. It's just covered up and with like rote behavior, dogma. And it's a shame. It works against, it's a force against really the spiritual experience. And that's a shame. And you do wonder whether in the future we might find some common ground or middle way between these extremes.
The image that I'm kind of getting is, taking a photo and then we want to email it to a friend. Our software compresses that photo, right? And for those that ever work with photos, you can choose the level of compression, right? If I keep it at 98%, it's going to be a really big file. If I make it a 10% file, it's going to be, it's not blurry, it's pixelated, right? And it can get across in a smaller file size. And in a sense, religion feels like it also compresses, right? This spiritual, mystical experience, right? It's taking something that maybe a sage had once experienced, then written down, and then tried to communicate it in a way that other people could say, oh, look at that. That's something that I can experience or I want to experience, right? But somehow along the way, that compression has also lost the magic, to use your words. And so what I'm seeing is this relationship between spiritual/mystical experiences and the compression of religion with how our brain actually works and the compression of reality. So I'm curious, like through this research that you found, I know you've also been focusing on certain mental illnesses and certain like expressions like anorexia. What have you found? Are there ways to maybe optimize the experience with psychedelics so that they can be more effective? Well, actually, let me backtrack for a moment. Would you say there's a goal for when people take psychedelics, such as my goal is to be able to see, quote unquote, see the experience of my reality in this moment, unfiltered, uncompressed, you know? And if there is a goal, like, how does that aim better our lives?
Well, there could be. It's sort of moves psychedelic use, psychedelic practice into spiritual practice and suggests that maybe there could be a goal where maybe a high ideal to keep in mind is wellness. And so to, cleanse the doors of perception such that we can, experience the world and things in a unfiltered, raw way that might be a state of being that is close to wellness. I think that's quite a reasonable idea. It would resonate with a lot of wisdom teachings, principles like the middle way in Buddhism and holding things lightly. In modern times, someone like Jack Cornfield might call it something like after the ecstasy, the laundry. It's not that after a state of spiritual bliss, some kind of, do they call it shanti or something like that type experience, you are then permanently enlightened and like, now you're a Buddha or Bodhisattva, and you can just walk around being happy and nice all the time, whatever's thrown at you. Wow, I would love that to be the case, but maybe there's something a little more realistic and pragmatic, which is a greater, generally a greater equanimity and ability to have some pause and patience when there might be triggering events happening around you. And so I think those are wonderful ideals. And I think they're ideals that are deeper and older. They have an older, well, I was going to say they have an older heritage than psychedelics, but of course psychedelics have a very old heritage. But what I mean is that these are principles that I would associate with wisdom teachings, spiritual teachings and practices, especially from the East and Hinduism and Buddhism especially. They don't need to be religious in the same way. One could argue that Buddhism doesn't need to be religious or isn't religious. I know it's practiced as a religion by many people, but others would argue it doesn't need to be, and its principles sort of transcend any strong form of narrative or dogma. And so I do think that there is a beautiful marriage that can happen between what I've heard called psychedelic practice, like conscious psychedelic use, and spiritual practice, or whatever that might be, meditation, yoga, hearing and reflecting on wisdom teachings, communing and communal practice. I do think there's a beautiful marriage there can happen, that does happen. And I really hope that gets worked in the future, like working a muscle, like that's a good space. And then back to the middle way, which is sort of part of it. Work it, but don't work it too hard. Yeah, it's like, become some canalized, some rigid way of being, new dogma or new religion. That would sort of be a contradiction of the initial intention. So I do hope and believe that marriage could be conducive to wellness, and ultimately maybe that's just bottom line. It's good to stop it there. That could be conducive to wellness. And then all the wisdoms and, awareness, sophisticated awareness of pitfalls that can come with both spiritual practice and psychedelic practice, or rather, spiritual practice and psychedelic use, such as flying too high, getting swept up in the fireworks of it. Within wisdom teachings, you'll find wise words about that, how to ground, how to temper such storms. And so again, it provides this roundedness that I think could really help the development and rollout of psychedelic use, psychedelic therapy, is to incorporate it in with wisdom teachings and so on. But yeah, I very much believe that's true.
Thank you for sharing that. I love this word that you kept using around a marriage of what can seem like polarities. And it feels like even this conversation you and I are having virtually is a bit of a marriage in the sense that I'm a minister of Ceremonia, which is an entheogenic church, and you're a scientist. And, we started this conversation around this being a really pivotal time in the field of psychedelic science, right? And I think the pivotal time in the field of mental wellness and spiritual wellness too, because the increased acceptance and recognition of psychedelics is leading to orders of magnitudes of, better results for a variety of mental health issues compared to alternative treatments, right? With antidepressants and psychiatric treatments with psychotherapy. And so it seems really poignant that we're talking about science and spirituality here. And what's interesting is, we work with a variety of different individuals here, including people who are come in as atheists. And what I've observed is that no matter what someone believes, whether Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or atheist, they tend to have a spiritual or mystical experience, right? And even those words, spiritual, mystical, they're conveniences for you and me and our listeners to attempt to understand something we're trying to communicate, right? And by its very nature, a mystical or spiritual experience communicates something that is not really understandable. It's something that must be experienced, right? So I'm curious, with your research now, like, given that you have this unique lens of having had your own mystical and spiritual experiences on LSD as a teenager, studying the hard science of it and the receptors that are firing off and coming up with the entropic brain hypothesis and looking at the applications for various different illnesses, is there a way now to optimize the set and setting or optimize how we approach psychedelics, whether that be set and setting or the actual drug itself, or, what variables have you learned can we optimize for towards this end goal of having maybe, I think the word used is a more equanimous way of living our life?
Well, there's nothing new under the sun is a humble way to put it, in the sense that people have been learning to optimize how to use psychedelics for millennia. And whatever the culture and part of the world, they tend to come upon similar things, like a sort of, transcultural realization. Music is pretty center stage. Aspects of ritual, which include, respect and reverence for the moment and the opportunity presented by all aspects of things, including the compound, often referred to as the sacred, like a sacrament. So that respect, and it could take on the form of culturally specific religious terminology, but it doesn't need to. And I think the core factors and common denominators would be that sense of reverence and respect, present-centeredness, sufficient respect to prepare well for the experience, even sufficient respect and understanding to not go through with it if that ever feels right, postpone it, or so on. Principles of trust and good practice in relationally, and openness on the part of the individual going in, so a willingness to surrender some of our ordinary critical thinking, which is hard, for a scientist. It's a sort of antithesis to, standard default way of being as a scientist, which is to be skeptical. You come in, sure, with inquiry and inquiring mind. That's consistent. You also come in with quite a strict skepticism, and that's helpful. That serves a scientist, but it's not really serving an optimal in the context of a psychedelic ceremony, for example, where it's probably more beneficial to surrender disbelief in that way and be willing to be swept up in the magic of the occasion, so long as one is well held and safe. That surfing, that, getting into the waters and being brave, being courageous to, try and catch a wave is more optimal, I believe, than, I don't know, sitting on the beach wishing you could, take part or being on your phone or something. So there's something about the diving in, the surrender, the willingness to confront, which is courage and inquiry, and then the importance of the relational factors, the good foundations, the trust. Also, the preparedness such that you prepare not just ahead of time, but you prepare, I guess this is part of that, but you prepare for the aftermath as well. There be sufficient time and opportunity for grounding and sharing. So I'm trying to describe the rounded picture of an optimal process. And of course, we live in the real world and we can't always have optimal like that. But all the same, it's good to describe it, the ideal, and know what it is so that one can sort of aspire to getting as close to the ideal as we can. I think community is really important. Peer-to-peer, having a support network. Yes, a support person or people who are like your guardian angels who'll look after you during the experience and be there to share in a personal way afterwards. But then after that, a sense of community, Sangha in Buddhism, really core principle, to have that there is really essentially important, can help with the grounding and the deepening and the sustaining of the realizations and the positive changes, can also help catch you when you fall, which we all fall from time to time. So, it's all about sort of fostering, cultivating a good garden, and helping each other out in the maintenance of our kind of communal garden in a sense. Yeah. And there's, there are these high ideals and they might feel hard to aspire towards, almost frightening in how they could be so perfect, potentially. Like, I could never have that. I don't deserve that. Or if I get it, I'll need to fall from it because it will feel too alien and scary. But that's all part of the picture, and there are wise people around in communities and teachers who can recognize that and tell people, oh no, you do deserve this, you can have this, we can all have this. Yeah, and to be porous as well, meaning not to be like a cult, closed off. The big bad world's out there with all its failings and fallibilities and, vices and so on. And here's our good world in here, and let's protect ourselves from that big bad world out there. We don't want it to go that way because then it can go the classic way of a cult and not have good exchange and openness with the wider world. So again, there are wise teachings and people who can recognize that danger as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, you said a lot to very few words. One of the things that I gathered was even looking at indigenous traditions or mindfulness traditions that have been around for thousands of years as guides towards us having right relationship with psychedelics and getting the best out of it. I like to think of the psychedelic experience as like a compressed, focused experience of life, right? Like we are visiting memories. We are possibly visiting traumas that have been long there. And the way that I often explain it to people that haven't had that experience is it's kind of like a dream, where in a dream, you're not observing yourself remembering a thing, you're actually reliving the thing, right? Except this time around, you can relive that experience and have more agency on how you approach it, such as observing it from a distance rather than being in it and swept up in it, right? And I think mindfulness traditions and indigenous traditions have so much to say about how to enter into that sort of, loving kindness or observer mindset to be able to approach these really hard things in a way that is much more manageable for us. And then again, that creates training for us going back into real life, right? Because then, I like to say life is going to continue to life, right? Buddhism says everything we love, we will lose. And so there's almost a preparedness that the psychedelic experience can create for us, right? Like a simulation for us, how to approach the future challenges of life that we'll have. Does that resonate with you?
Oh, very much. Very much. Yeah. There's a beauty, but there's that recognition of suffering and impermanent. And so that, like Stoicism, there's a sort of readying, as you say, preparedness for the inevitable, losing the things that we value. But that is part of the picture. That's the way things really are. So there's a beauty, arguably, even in that truth, it's the way things are, and that therefore is, in a sense, perfect, you could say. Yeah, so I do think it can foster a resilience. I guess the equanimity it comes with, as is sort of taught in Stoicism, meditating on struggle and loss in a funny way fosters an appreciation, a gratitude, and a wellness out of it. So better to recognize and embrace than ignore and avoid. Yeah, even if the recognition and the embracing and the confronting is very difficult and very painful, ultimately it will, foster a greater benefit from doing that work, so to speak. So, yeah.
Through Ceremonia, I've worked with a broad range of people that have come through. We've had combat veterans with PTSD. We've had mothers with treatment-resistant depression. We've had, high-performing billionaires, right? And the author of, or the founder of Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, ACT, talks about the need for scope and depth when looking at a framework, right? Like ACT, which is sort of a clinical look at mindfulness, has proved to have great scope and depth, aka it's valid for a variety of mental issues as well as high performers. And it has the capacity to help people at a very deep level, right? And have systemic, long-term, durable change. It seems like psychedelics is similar in that regard, right? I know you're studying psychedelic therapy for anorexia, but there are so many studies for PTSD, for depression, for so many different things. One of the least studied aspects, it seems to me, is for positive psychology or bettering the well, right? But I myself have seen empirically like how extraordinary it's been for founders and entrepreneurs getting a new lease on life, getting out of burnout, inspiring them into greater creativity, right? Steve Jobs is well known for saying it was the second best thing he's ever done in his life was LSD. The first was found Apple, right? So where do you think that scope and depth comes from in psychedelics?
Yeah, I love how you put it. Scope and depth. That's really good. And I can appreciate ACT and that it has great scope and depth, meaning it can work for a lot. That's the scope, or at least this is how I'm interpreting it. Great scope in working for a lot of different, say, psychopathologies and wellness, and depth in working well as well. And I think psychedelic therapy does fit that. And funnily enough, it resonates well, it harmonizes well with ACT. It's one of the psychotherapy that it does especially harmonize well with. Yeah, another might be internal family systems. Yeah, but it makes sense of a lot. It can make sense of a lot and complement a lot. Even CBT and psychoanalysis, almost two extremes, Psychoanalysis takes a long time. It's not very pragmatic, but it goes very deep. CBT is comparatively shallow, I would say, and fast, but it's very pragmatic. So anyway, psychedelics are a complement to many different psychotherapeutic models and approaches, I believe, because in a pluralistic way, there's something to them all. I think that's quite fair that at least the well-known ones all have something to them and have some common factors. Now, why should psychedelic therapy have great scope and depth? First of all, does it? Well, I think it does, and when I present on psychedelic science, I try to make that point. I list all the trials. There's a lot in depression, but there's newer ones in different types of anxiety, and then OCD. We'll see more and more come through. I guess being fortunate as a scientist in the space, I'm privy to trials that are either underway or completed, but not yet published. And so I can tell the viewers and listeners that there's a lot to come that'll very much fit this model, that psychedelic therapy works well for a lot, that it's not just depression, it's not just end-of-life anxiety, not that those are trivial things at all, but it's the lion's share of mental illness and health. So already there's a lot of studies showing improvements in well-being and life satisfaction. There'll be more of that. I've got more of that to come. And so that's this fantastic scope and the depth, that the results are really good. So take depression across the trials, the response rates, what percentage of people have a substantial drop in their depressive symptom severity such that you can make things kind of black and white and say, oh, they're a responder. It worked. And we have a system for doing that. It's a halving of your baseline symptom severity, your score for how depressed you are. And with SSRIs and psychotherapy, on average, pooling all the data, it tends to hover around 50% response. So not bad, but not great. And they take a long time, and the drugs come with a bunch of side effects and other subtle complexities, I believe. Drugs like SSRIs. Psychotherapy brings its own complexities, but I would favor that approach for human reasons. But yeah, psychedelic therapy, its response rates in depression across trials are higher than that 50% benchmark. It's more like 70%. Some trials, I think there are 3 now, have hit an 80% response rate. Being realistic, that's about as high as you could get with any intervention, just because of individual differences and natural variability around a lot of different things. It's only realistic, really, to think that something like 70, 80%, that's probably the upper limit of what's possible. So, yeah, and then there's that view that actually if we continue the research and better educate people about the model, then, the field will be more reliable in such good responses. And we'll also get wiser about catching the adverse events, which happen. And I think we're learning a lot quite quickly about the pitfalls and how to safeguard this space. And that's so important given the history of psychedelics in modern times, at least, and ancient or historic, in terms of them being a fragile model that's easy to straw man and knock down and project all sorts of bad things into that may or may not be fair. Except, bottom line, we can say that psychedelics are very vulnerable to that projection, both lifting it up too high in terms of hype and smashing it down too hard in terms of alarmism and scaremongering. So great scope, great depth. And why? Because I believe there's something very telling in that, that it must be hitting a common denominator, like more or less hitting the bullseye of the core of mental health. What is mental health? What is mental illness? Maybe this has great scope and depth because it really hones in on and slams into the center of the essence of mental health. And which is very exciting.
And what do you think that is?
Well,
you can't just point at the bullseye and not tell us what you think it is.
I was hoping that would be the next question. Yeah, I put some jargon on it and call it canalization. So let's unpack the jargon. That has a history, that analogy, because within that is a analogy or a metaphor. It's a canal. I guess in industrial times, canals were everywhere and they're dug into the earth and they limit the flow of things. They allow the flow of things like goods, textiles or whatever. But they also they allow a flow, but a flow only really in one or two directions. So there's freedom in the space of flow, but also constraint. And that's really important. There is a constraining of freedom of movement. I playfully like to say a free brain is a happy brain, and where brain-mind are interchangeable there. But freedom and happiness are very close, I believe. And the process of canalization, which other more familiar, accessible terms might be entrenchment, stuckness, rigidity. The nature of the dynamics that I'm trying to describe here, which is the dynamics of pathology, of illness, are all about a reduction of freedom. You fall into a depression, you lose your freedom, you are stuck in this negative, ruminative, pessimistic state of mind. Everything is seen through this dark, negatively biased ego tunnel. And that applies to the self, to the world, to other people. And it's so hard to escape. And you can just run through all the different flavors of psychopathology, whether it's anorexia and the fierce, controlling nature, the caloric control, the self-loathing, the punitive aspect of it, the sort of self-starvation, starving oneself of nourishment, like starving oneself of love. I don't deserve love, and so on. It's all an entrenchment of a way of being. And they're like a slow suicide, almost an entrenchment of a way of removing oneself from even being, very tragic. But it's all a very consistent picture of entrenchment, of digging those trenches deeper and deeper, those canals deeper and deeper, less and less freedom, more and more enslavement. In addiction, classically, I think addiction might even mean something like enslavement. You lose your freedom. You lose your freedom. And yet, tragically, thinkers and writers like Gabor Mate would tell us there's a function to it. Like, ask not why the addiction, but why the pain. I think it goes something like that. Why the suffering? Yeah, why the pain? What's underneath it? But so it's doing something for someone. What is that? It's probably giving them some sense of what's what in a world that it is otherwise intolerable. At least there's my crack pipe, or the sense of having control by starving oneself, or the safe retreat into a dark room in depression. So it's tragic, but it's sort of functional. It's maladaptive, but also sort of tragically adaptive. And I think that's the bullseye. It's that we retreat into those defensive spaces. I really think that's why IFS has been as popular in over recent years, is that Richard Schwartz captured defense and critical role of defense in psychopathology. And yeah, he poetically described it as parts, these protective parts, which has been good for, articulating that position. But I'd more fundamentally perhaps see it as defense, just the different flavors of defense that we can all do. And so what do psychedelics do? Well, they shatter defense, and that's why they're as scary as they are, and also controversial because, why, for example, when people have come in and challenged psychedelic therapy, they've said things like, it was like I was left on the operating room table. It was open heart surgery. They opened up my heart. I'd closed my heart down and I was okay like that. Thank you very much. You opened my heart up, you son of a gun. And then you left me there, you can see it's like you made me vulnerable. I felt again. And then you sauntered off. That's the resentment. And when you hear it, you can feel it and you're sorry for it. That's the limitation that we're looking at. And that's why things like community support and wisdom teachings and, hearing that kind of likely repeating of history for someone who would say that, oh, you abandoned me too. Like all the others. It opens your heart to such situations. So that's the vulnerability. The power of psychedelic therapy, the power for benefit is the same power for harm. Its potential merits are at the same time as potential, soft spot, weakness, limitation. Opening people up is very powerful. But, that's why it's so important to yield that power wisely. But yeah, so there's the problem. It's your sharp minima is what someone like Carl Friston would call it, like a space in a landscape that has a deep valley that you get stuck in and then you can't see out of. You can only see the walls of your cave, Plato-like analogy. And psychedelics, through the entropic action and sort of melting these sharp valleys enable you to see again what's going on and what's what. And, naturally promote a rebalance, a recalibration. But for those who've suffered awful trauma and adversity in their life, that's a scary prospect, is to be taken out of, your safe cave. And it ain't a trivial thing to venture out that way. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. That's beautiful. There's a Buddhist teacher named Joseph Goldstein that says, the problem isn't that you think you're real, it's that you think you're really real. When we started our conversation around the entropic brain and how psychedelics promotes a sense of chaos, well, that's in many ways reflective of what reality actually is. Reality isn't ordered, right? We cannot predict even if we'll be alive tomorrow, right? And yet the attempt to control all the infinite amount of variables in our lives is actually, that attempt to control is an attempt to get freedom, but it's actually what limits us from freedom, right? And the mechanisms that we do in life are also reflected in the mechanisms in the brain. This is kind of what I'm seeing. And there seems to be this top-down element from spirituality to psychology to the neuroscience that has a through line of the bullseye, as you point out. Like, how do we get out of the stuckness, right? How do we get unstuck and into being able to be with reality without the judgment, without the boxing in, without the framing, and to be with each other in that way? Community being such a huge part of that. Well, this has been a really enlightening discussion, and I'm walking away from this with a deeper appreciation of you, Robin. We've been in a few circles together. I know you were part of a company that I was on the board of before, Maya Health, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you and not only your scientific brain. At one point, I wanted to major in physics and I studied math, etc. So I resonate with that side too, but also the deep appreciation for how your teenage curiosity, your own personal experiences has led you down this path of deep exploration. And with all the sort of spiritual texts that you've quoted, I imagine that there's a richness to your own personal practice too. So really grateful to have you at the helm of this Carhart-Harris Lab at UCSF doing pioneering research. Would love to just hear what you're excited about. I know you have a book that you're writing. Maybe there's research you're excited about, what you're excited about, and how people can find you.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thanks, Austin, for hearing that. Yeah, I appreciate the appreciation. It's mutual. Thank you. Well, I'm enjoying writing that book. It's consuming me in a way that I enjoy, canalizing my mind a bit. But then it's also an open, it's an open space, so it's freeing as well. But, I'm looking forward to sharing that with people. I'll drip bits in as part of like a launch process, the pre-launch marketing, if you want, over the next few months, and then hopefully get things wrapped up and sorted so that it will publish sometime next year. I'm not sure when. How Psychedelics Work is the working title, and that means how it works to generate or underpin tripping, the trip itself, so to speak, and the psychedelic therapy as well, the mechanisms there. In terms of research, people aren't aware of the trials that have been completed by my colleagues at Imperial. They probably catch the gist of it through presentations and things like this. But I'm excited that they'll share with the world quite soon. The results of our anorexia trial were very promising. Some interesting sort of head-scratching components there about what might have made the difference in that anorexia trial. Promising. And then a fibromyalgia syndrome trial, so chronic generalized pain. Very good results there. And also the nature of the action. An interesting fresh light has been shed on things in that regard. Crucial question here all the time, very much underpins my approach, is how does this work? And people don't always realize why that's so important. And one way I articulate it these days is to say, well, placebo works in about 30, 40% of people. And are you happy enough to be given snake oil? And if you're not, then you care about how things work too, How things work really matters, actually, because we want something more than snake oil. And that's sort of, derogatory about expectancy. Let's, say something about that we shouldn't necessarily be so derogatory, that positive expectancy is part of, so much of medicine. I can't quite remember who it was, said that it's the meat of medicine, which is interesting and not far off. We've been doing those trials. Really, my colleagues did the hard work with those trials, but it takes a team. And then at UCSF, I'm close to completing my first big study. And these days, a hot topic in science is deep data or big data. Most people think of that as, it's sort of like scope in a sense. It's like, it's big across people. So big populations, like get your wearable data and in thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And you've got exceptionally big data and you can see patterns that otherwise you wouldn't see because of just how broad your scope is of your sampling. That's true. It's kind of hard to do in the psychedelic space, but we've done online surveying in the past and we're working on a new version of that at the moment. But you can also go deep, so scope and depth. And going deep might mean, in my world, means going deep within subjects. So within a given individual, do a lot of sampling. And we did that recently. And that's my first study at UCSF, was doing a heck of a lot of scanning within individual participants coming in, 15 hours of functional brain imaging data
Wow.
9 hours of which is while they're tripping on psilocybin. So that exceptional depth of data, that novel data, will hopefully yield novel insights. It tends to go that way. So I'm really excited about that. The team, Lorenzo Pasquini and Minesh Gurn, Patrick McConnell, Hannes Kettner, and I've got a fabulous team now at UCSF, and they're all working on those data. And then a new study I've launched is a set and setting study for 4 group, 2 factors with 2 levels. One of the factors is drug versus placebo, drug psilocybin, high dose, 25 milligrams. And the other factor with its 2 levels is set and setting, where we have an enriched set and setting with music and prep and lovely trained guides doing psychedelic therapy and integration, beautifully decorated room and scents and all the good stuff. And then we have a basic safety condition that we call the unenriched set and setting, which strips those things away, including music. And so it's a critical study. It's a daring study, but a necessary study to test that strong assumption that we hold in the clinical space around psychedelic therapy and what we think it is, but isn't shared in the preclinical space and isn't shared in industry, where there's a move to think that maybe psychedelics could be turned into something like an SSRI, taken daily, where you don't need to trip, you don't need all that scary psychedelic stuff, but you can still get the benefits. Strong motivated reasoning there, otherwise known as wishful thinking. And they could be right and I could be wrong, and let's hope, it is that way, because then there would be another tool in the toolkit. I'm not saying everyone needs to trip necessarily. I'm just saying I'm a little skeptical that will really bear out like some people are selling pretty hard.
You're speaking to microdosing.
Yeah, microdosing is part of it, but even microdosing without the depth and richness of the therapy of psychedelic therapy, I'm a little skeptical of. I guess this is coming from, I would say, an appreciation of the human roundedness of psychotherapy and skepticism that you can get all the good stuff with just drug alone. To me, that feels too myopic, biocentric, and for that reason, unrealistic, like it's always going to miss on the other aspects of things. Some might call the biopsychosocial or even biopsychosocial spiritual model, that there's a fullness and a roundedness to a therapeutic approach that isn't just about biology and just about drugs, but also considers the other aspects of things. And I'm of that school of thought that you'll always have a fragile treatment, a shallow treatment, and potentially even a problematic, harmful treatment if you neglect those other components. So that's the part of the reasoning and the motivation between doing the set and setting study is, yes, we're doing something daring, but it's daring for a reason, because we want to test our assumptions. And if it transpires that psilocybin is much better for people if you twin it with the enriched set and setting, well, that's going to be pretty hard to argue against. It'll be in human beings, the species that ultimately in our world and context is center stage. And so it would be hard to break that model down if we show what we think is true, that, drug and therapy, drug and set and setting synergize in this way. So that's why we're doing that work.
Thank you, Robin. Appreciate all the work that you do. If people want to contact you, find you online, what's the best way?
Well, in a sense, because of the book, I've sort of upped my social media presence.
I saw that.
So that means I'm on virtually every platform. My lab's website is Carhart-HarrisLab.com. Carhart-Harris Lab's all one word, no hyphen in Carhart-Harris. Quick Google search will find it all. But yeah, the website's there, and then it's easy to find me on all the different social media outlets.
Well, this has been a beautiful discussion. Really appreciate all the work that you do and your beautiful spirit. So thank you again, Robin.
That's lovely. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Modern Enlightenment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to check out our website, subscribe to our online community, and check out our social media links in the show notes for more resources and updates.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay connected with our upcoming episodes, where we continue to explore the intersection of modern science and spiritual wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep shining your light.